I think the impetus behind this project was created by Communities of Tomorrow when they identified the need to create a set of management guidelines that all the Saskatchewan communities can access because there was a lack of information available to people if they wanted to improve their snow dump sites or to create new snow dump sites. In addition, it was recognized that as Saskatchewan continues to grow, there might be an opportunity, or there might be regulation changes that would be imposed on communities that would then force them to improve their snow dump sites. I'd also like to acknowledge the City of Yorkton in the development of these guidelines. During the time of the commissioning of this report, AE was working with Yorkton to examine their existing snow dump site and to develop a conceptual design for improvements to it. So Trent and his staff's feedback has been incorporated as well. An overview of our presentation will include just a very brief background about snow dump sites, a summary of the existing practices within Saskatchewan based on a brief survey that we conducted for the municipalities, followed by a review of the regulations that are applicable at the moment. We'll get into site selection and design considerations, and all of you should have a handout right now that we will go through, and it'll be a self-evaluation. We'll get into site management considerations, which Nav will be discussing in more detail, and that will look at operation and maintenance, as well as monitoring and remediation, followed by a summary and recommendations. So snow dump site, the general definition of it is a designated area to deposit accumulated snowfall collected from roadways and parking lots. And snow dump sites can vary in complexity. You can have the very basic ones, which are predominant in Saskatchewan, where it's just an open field where snow is just randomly dumped, to more complex engineered facilities that can be multi-million dollars. But they all pose the same challenges regardless of their design, and that is that snow contains contaminants, and then when those contaminants melt, they can negatively impact the environment. The other challenge associated with snow dumps is that there's very little information that exists out there, especially from a regulatory perspective, guiding communities in how to manage their snow dump facilities. So the brief survey that was conducted of the municipalities, we looked at 5 different areas, the first being siting. And to no surprise, every community in Saskatchewan pretty much has a snow dump site. Some communities would have multiple sites, and most of those are located on municipally owned land. Some are located on privately held land. Policies, pretty much every community has a snow dump removal policy applicable to their roads and prioritization of snow removal, but none of the communities that responded to us had any policies related to their snow disposal. Operation and maintenance, winter is pretty straightforward. Most communities either just dumped and drove away, or they dump and pile, and push with like a dozer or something. Some communities would grade their snow dump area in the summertime, as well as like mow it for aesthetic appeal. Environmental mitigation measures. No communities that we communicated with had explicit measures in place to reduce their environmental impact. It's important to note that some communities did not use salt, which of course would reduce their environmental impact, and Nav will be speaking about that in a bit more detail in the environmental management side of things. And generally the concerns, there weren't a lot of communities that had a significant concern about their snow dump. It's not front and center to their everyday thinking, but they did express a concern if future regulations were going to be implemented, which is a bit of the reason behind this report. As far as regulations at the moment, in Saskatchewan, there are no direct regulations that impact snow dump sites. However, there are a number of federal and provincial regulations that extrinsically are linked to them. At a federal level, you have the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, the Fisheries Act, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife, the Migratory Birds Convention Act, as well as the Canadian Council for Ministry of Environment guidelines. Those can all apply indirectly to snow dump sites. From a provincial level, You have the Ministry of Environment's Surface Water Quality Objectives, the Environmental Management and Protection Act, as well as the Wildlife Act. In particular, stormwater guidelines are highlighted, and in conversation with the ministry, if future regulations are imposed, they'll probably most likely reflect the stormwater quality guidelines. The province of Alberta is a little bit ahead of the game. Back in 1994, they developed snow disposal guidelines, which are an appendice within the report, if you ever do want to reference those. Whereas Saskatchewan and Manitoba, they don't have anything currently in place. And of course, at a municipal level, every municipality is different in how they have their bylaws and what they want, and that can vary among communities as well, depending on size usually. Okay, so now for the interaction part of this presentation. Everyone will have a handout titled, or that looks just like the one on the slide here. And this is a bit of an exercise for people just to reflect on their community's snow dump site, okay? If you have multiple sites, just select one, keep that in mind, and evaluate it based on these criteria, okay? It doesn't matter if you're the guru of snow dumps within your community. Just through your own perspective of snow dumps, just evaluate it based on these criteria. And what will happen, I'll go through the criteria, explain the ideal situation regarding the site selection for a snow dump, and then you will rate your existing snow dump according to 1 to 5, 1 being very poor, 5 being excellent. At the end of it, we're just going to go around the room very quickly, show of hands, see where people stand with their perception of their snow dump. Okay, so to begin with, the first selection criteria, if everyone's clear, are there any questions about that on what we're doing here? I think it makes sense. Okay, great. The first criteria is noise. So ideally, your snow dump site will be located greater than 350 meters away from residents or businesses. Okay. Next consideration is haul routes. Ideally, your snow dump will be located to the snow removal area to reduce your haul routes. You don't want your trucks traveling like 20 kilometers outside of the community in order to dump their snow if it can be helped to reduce economic cost. Next consideration is zoning. Ideally, your snow dump site will be situated on land that will be zoned for industrial usage, and that the land surrounding that site will also be zoned for industrial usage to prevent any type of future remediation measures that might have to happen if you ever sell that land. Next consideration is landfills. Ideally, your snow dump will not be in proximity to landfill or be situated on top of a landfill. Of course, the risk to that is increased leachate production and groundwater contamination. The next consideration is surface water. Ideally, your snow dump will not be within 200 meters of a surface water body, such as a lake or a river or anything such as that. Next is drainage courses. Ideally, your snow dump will have the capacity to accept all of the meltwater runoff and not create any surcharging within your storm sewer or your sewer system, depending on how you're getting rid of that water, or flood any kind of drainage channels. Next, So that's all for surrounding land use. Everyone is ticking their little boxes and things are going well. I assume silence means it's all good. We'll get into site land use itself. So now focus your attention not on the surrounding land area, but on the actual site itself, all right? Agriculture is the first consideration. Does your snow dump, is it situated on prime agricultural land? The risk there is contamination of soil. Next consideration is recreation. Is your site situated on land that is used for recreation, either in the summer or in the winter? And the risk there is health and safety. With all the debris that might exist, any glass or stuff like that, that could be within the site. The next consideration is environmentally sensitive land. Is it situated on a parcel of land where there are wetlands or any protected flora and fauna? Next consideration is soil. Ideally, your snow dump will not have permeable soils. You want that meltwater to run right off of your snow dump instead of infiltrate. Any of that infiltration could impact groundwater, especially if it's used for consumption. The next consideration is groundwater. Ideally, your snow dump is not situated near an aquifer or directly above it to avoid that contamination. Next consideration is heritage land. Ideally, it's not situated on a parcel of land where there's any heritage artifacts. Next consideration is existing infrastructure. Ideally, your snow dump will not share a parcel of land where there are other buildings, power lines, railways, or other easements. And this, of course, can impact operation and maintenance of both the snow dump and that piece of infrastructure. Next consideration is size. Ideally, your snow dump will be large enough to accommodate both current and future capacity issues, as well as any treatment processes that you might want to introduce in the future, and any site traffic that would use that site. Next consideration is shape. Ideally, your snow dump site would be rectangular or square in shape to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of operation and maintenance practices. Next consideration and last consideration is topography. Ideally, your snow dump will be gently sloping to allow for drainage in a controlled manner. You don't want it to be too fast to create erosion, and you also don't want it to be pooling on that property. So that concludes the self-evaluation for site selection considerations. Now, if everyone can quickly tally the values to come up with one final number, a total. Hopefully it doesn't take too long. We can just go around the room, and by a show of hands, people can just raise where they are based on the range that I provide. Lots of thinking going on right now, that's good. Okay, so did anybody get a value greater than 80? Okay, all right, he's not our mathematician. That was a bit of a trick question, sorry. You can't get a score greater than 80. Anyways, did anyone get a value between 60 to 80? Okay, good for you guys, yeah. Give yourselves a round of applause if you want. Good work.
I have one quick comment.
Oh yeah, please. Mm-hmm. Environment Canada shut me down. Okay.
We had a rating of 4.
Oh, really?
So we completely moved ours to what you have here.
Mm-hmm.
Is probably what I meant. It looks very similar to
Mm-hmm.
what they wanted.
Right on.
That's the only reason we got a high rating. They wouldn't pass me. They said you're not done with snow.
Okay, right on. So there's a real life example. A real life example of someone who went from a 4 maybe to a 66. So that's great. Cool. So there were quite a few, 60 to 80s. Anyone between 40 to 60? Yeah. All right. Great. Anyone below 40? All right. Okay. We might talk to you later. We'll give you our cards if you want to chat with us. Okay. Okay. Well, great. Depending if you want to. Perhaps, yeah. Depending if you want to call it a wetland or not, I guess, but yeah, to be interpreted. Okay, so that's it for the site selection considerations. Maybe you guys, if you want to use that as a point of conversation later on or whatever, feel free, of course.
One other question on
Yeah, please.
maybe you're going to address this, but on the surface water, I struggle with that one. Speaking of wetlands, sometimes communities will build storm protection ponds, more so now.
Mm.
Intent of collecting storm water, cleaning it up, and over time it kind of turns into a wetland. I don't know, maybe more of an environmental question. Or does it? Like, it starts to develop cattails and so on and so forth. So what happens if you build that to accommodate storm water, which I assume that it's okay for snow melt, and then it becomes a sensitive wetland, and you get the blue turbine. Is there discussion on that? Or?
Not within the report, perhaps, Nav. I don't know if you have any experience with that, but...
Yeah, so, I mean, it comes with how you, or the purpose, how you design your snow dump, right? There are different ways or different options for, so let me back up a second. So you can design your wetlands to either have the purpose of it being infiltration, so more of a storage one, or you can design it to, like you said, potentially remediate it and provide habitat, so that you can either let it sit there and be a lake or a pond, or discharge it slowly out into a neighboring water body. Now, I guess your question is, if it becomes a habitat, and then you would have to measure the surface water quality and see if it is detrimental, and then if it is, well then there are some regulations. The regulations surrounding protection of aquatic life are a little bit stronger than any regulations for snow dump, which there are pretty much next to none. So in that case, yeah, you would be liable. But then, that would come in your design consideration. Well, then, maybe that's not something that you want to do. Again, you would look at volumes of snow, the concentrations of contaminants in the snow, and then whether that system can handle it without going over the limits. So instead of maybe, a small wetland, you would want to pretty much back calculate what your concentrations are that over the years can accumulate what the capacity of that wetlands is. And so maybe instead of a small one, you want to design a bigger one so that it does have that capacity. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah.
Great. Any other questions before we proceed? Okay, so right now we've looked at existing practices and existing regulations that could apply to snow dumps, as well as site selection considerations. We're now going to get into site design considerations. And this gets a little bit more into detail, which would be very site-specific to the needs of the community, as well as the regulations that you want to adhere to. All right, so we won't go into too much detail about it, but I'll just go over some of the criteria. That photo right there, that is not Mount Blackstrap, okay? That is actually the City of Edmonton snow dump facility. And those aren't kids sledding down the hill. Those are D10 dozers pushing snow up to the very top. So you can just see the magnitude of how the operation and maintenance practice that they've decided to select, and just how they're actually doing that. That's about 20 stories high, that snow dump facility, what it gets to at the height. And AE actually designed that site in Edmonton, So some communities might want it designed to a standard like that, whereas other communities might reflect a little bit more something like this, where it's just an abandoned parking lot where the community, where they've just dumped snow and they've just piled it, and they just continue to pile it into a shape. So it really depends on what the desire of the community is and what the need is, and also what set of criteria and design standards you want to meet. But very briefly, those 5 key design considerations are going to include capacity. So what is the capacity of the site that you want to design to? Is there going to be adequate access for vehicles, dumping zones, storage for all your snow, equipment storage, any berms for noise retention? What are the type of O&M practices that you want? Do you want to expand it into the future? All those kind of considerations for capacity. Another key one is surface. What type of surface is your snow dump going to be? What kind of working platform? Is it going to be a concrete, an asphalt? Is it clay? Maybe you don't even want to do any compaction. Those are pretty key considerations when it relates to drainage. As well as grading is a key drainage consideration. You want to be able to direct your snow melt into either a certain drainage channel or a storage area or whatever, as well as prevent any off-site drainage entering that site. Fourth consideration is access. You want to make sure that your site has adequate accessibility for all the heavy equipment that would be using it, both in a separate entry and an exit, lighting, fencing for security, all that kind of stuff to deal with access. And lastly, the 5th consideration is water quality. What type of water quality do you want leaving your site and entering the environment? So that really depends largely on the type of contaminants within your snow, and Nav will touch on that a little bit when he discusses management. But there are a number of treatment processes. Settling ponds are very common. Wet ponds and constructed wetlands, which is kind of like what you had mentioned, the gentleman in this table here. that you can actually design facilities to be wetlands to do the treatment process for you. Those usually require a very large footprint though. Oil and grit separators, which is common for stormwater meeting stormwater guidelines, and they're often used in Alberta especially, or mechanical treatment. You can get really hardcore and do treatment processes just like you do for potable water systems if you wanted to meet a certain design criteria. This is that same Edmonton site, but just during the final commissioning process of it. So you can see they have a very large concrete pad, and they have two settling ponds there. One is a primary and the other is a secondary settling pond. And then afterwards that effluent is discharged into the environment. So again, site design considerations all depends on what the community wants and what they want to design for. And that's an important consideration when thinking about your snow dump. And on that note, I'm going to pass it over to Nav to talk more about site management issues.
So Garret summarized some information with respect to existing practices, applicable legislation, and and reducing adverse impacts through site location and site design. Another way to reduce adverse impacts is to look at site management practices, and these would include operation and maintenance, site monitoring, and site remediation, which is the stage that we want to try to avoid. So looking at some recommendations with respect to site operation, you want to dump snow starting at the lowest point in elevation. Your piling of snow should be in a southward direction to maximize sunlight exposure, and this will, of course, increase the rate of snow melt. You want to ensure there's unrestricted flow or surface water to ditches or swales. And you want to have some type of scheduled monitoring of soil, groundwater, and surface water. And this is to basically identify any potential problems that you might have now before they become bigger, more costly problems in the future. As mentioned before, the purpose of some site monitoring would be to identify a problem before it becomes a bigger, more costly one. Here is an example of a low-cost, simplified monitoring program that can be used to identify potential contaminants. So contaminants that are associated with snow dump typically are related to salts, heavy metals, and organics. There's also some physical concerns, and that would be sedimentation or suspended solids loads within water or meltwater that's being discharged into the environment, and erosion due to increased runoff from meltwater. So the first thing you would probably want to do is sample 4 matrices. Initially, I would start with taking a sample of the snow pile, the snow material itself, and analyzing it chemically. This will tell you a lot about what contaminants are in there and what you should be concerned about and at what concentrations. And if you use that with volumes, you can kind of get an idea of how to design your site. Second sample is if it is the water is being discharged into the natural environment during spring melt, then you'd want to take a sample somewhere downstream in an aquatic environment. The groundwater also also can become an issue, especially if you have a nearby aquifer that's being used to withdraw water for potable sources or irrigation and so on. And then soil, of course, you'd want to take a soil sample below the actual snow dump so that you can see if the soil is actually becoming contaminated. Of course, this will depend on the design. If you have a concrete pad or an asphalt pad, well, then you don't need to take a soil sample there. This sampling, I would say, at a minimum, you'd want to do it at least once a year to kind of have a record, especially if you're going to use the site continuously over multiple years. You can kind of see if any of the chemistry is changing over time. So site remediation. Well, the purpose of a site remediation is if you have a problem. The first thing to do is if you are going to potentially change the land use of where the snow dump is located, or if the property is going to be sold, you'd want to conduct an initial site assessment. And of course, the site assessment will depend on the objectives and use of the site as well. So what is the steps of remediation if it ever comes to that? Well, like I said, the first step would be to do a screening level site assessment, and what that does is it identifies the potential contaminants of concern on the site. It is mostly a desktop review, so you're looking at historical land uses to make sure that the contamination is actually from the snow dump and not from a previous land use, if that was the case. The detailed site is complementary, and it comes after the first step, and this is where you do the sampling. You would sample the matrices and identify contaminant concentrations in those matrices. After that's done, you incorporate that information into a remediation management strategy. And what this does is, in here, you will compare what the concentrations are in those different matrices of those contaminants to establish criteria for specific land uses. What that remediation management strategy also should include is a discussion of what your remediation objectives are, and that will depend on what your goals are for that site, and also a discussion of which remediation technologies are best suited to obtain those objectives. So here's a table. I don't expect you to read it or learn it or anything. It is kind of a small print. There's just some key features of here. So these are all, or not all, these are some of the more common remediation technologies. Not all of these are going to be applicable to snow dump sites. And what you need to do, or what you can take away from this slide, is that the different technologies are used for cleaning up different contaminants. And there's different costs associated with different technologies. Typically, there will be more than one technology will be used in combination with one another. And of course, all the technologies have their advantages and disadvantages and pros and cons. So instead of listing off what these things are, I've put up a few pictures just to get some visuals here. But one of the common remediation technologies, well, it's not really a technology, but options is the excavation and disposal, and this is your typical, or commonly referred to as your dig and dump. And what this is just a physical removal of any contaminated material, soils offsite. Once that material is removed, you can either landfill it or you can treat it and reuse it for a different end use. Downside is that you're going to have to replace the material that you excavated with some cleaner material, and that could be costly. This is typically effective for most types of contaminants, so any of the ones that you'd be dealing with in snow dumps should be captured by this. It is one of the technologies that are more accepted because there is less potential for residual contamination after the fact. This treatment technology is typically used to treat surface water or groundwater, and essentially you're just pumping the water out into a vessel that contains carbon or charcoal or some other type of media, but in essence it just traps your contaminants as the water comes through, and then the water can be released into the freshwater environment because it's been treated, or you can find a different use for it. Downside of this treatment technology or remediation technology is that some of the media inside these vessels will either have to be reactivated or replaced, and of course that depends on the volume of water that you're actually treating. So you can see that there's a little bit more of operation and maintenance costs with a treatment like this. And if you're dealing with groundwater, it might take a little longer than your typical other treatments. So, electrokinesis. So I put this one up because it's kind of more of an innovative technique. So essentially, you're putting 2 electrodes into the ground. This technique can be used in combination with other techniques like the dig and dump technique. So essentially, you put 2 electrodes in the ground. You run a voltage difference across them, and your negative species will be attracted towards or migrate towards your anode, and your positive species will be attracted or migrate towards the cathode, at which point you just have to excavate the localized material around the cathode instead of trying to excavate the whole thing, so you'll save some money there. And oil and grit separators, well, this can be used as a remediation technology for pumped water, or you can actually use this as part of your treatment. So if you do have a wetlands and you're discharging into the environment, you can kind of put this at the end of it so that before you release it to an environment, you are getting some treatment. This treatment is good for oil and grease and to reduce your suspended solids load. And there's different types, and the one on the right is just a baffle system. So,
thanks, Nav. So just in summary, for the best management practices that were developed, basically they leverage existing knowledge and experience in order for communities to then review and either improve their existing sites, or if you're in the market to develop a new site, this information can be very applicable for you as well. It looks at the existing practices, what kind of regulations exist, any site selection or site design considerations, as well as site management, which tackles operation and maintenance, remediation, and monitoring. So the whole point behind this report is to provide a one-stop shop for communities to review if they are interested in improving their snow dumps. And recommendations, fairly brief. It's an opportunity for you as a community to identify your existing practices relative to best practices, and then of course act on that knowledge to implement any type of measure that you want to reduce the social, environmental, or economic implications of your site. There are lots of different improvements that communities can just do on their own, depending on, again, on what their needs are and what they want to achieve. Some things could be initiating a monitoring program, establishing any kind of fencing, improving their surface drainage. But if you did ever want to get into more complicated systems, definitely recommend finding someone with some experience to help you out through that as well. And on that note, I'd like to thank everybody, and I think we'll probably go through the whole question process.
We'll just check. Is there any questions popping up right now that come to mind during the presentation?
I just had a few quick ones. You can tell me if they're referenced in the report or not, but you had mentioned in terms of proximity, you mentioned 200 meters from the water body. Where does that number come from? Is that sort of a best practice guideline? Or
That's a best practice guideline as stipulated in the Alberta snow disposal guidelines. So yeah.
Okay, and I just wanted to know your remediation technology list, that is in the report.
The remediation technology list, that one? Yeah, they're discussed. They're discussed in more detail. Pros and cons and the costs and stuff are listed for what contaminants they're useful for. And like I said, they're not all going to be applicable to snow dumps. But I thought I'd go there.
Because this is a relatively new area of endeavor, I take it. There's no real guidelines or regulations kicking around. I don't know how useful table discussion is going to be of this one. So we just throw it out there. So there's other thoughts? Mike's got one.
I was very happy to get this because we're trying to solve our snow problems. I think this is Yorkton built one, or is it like semi-permanent one?
Well, we haven't constructed it yet. It started with our existing site. It's in use right now. It's going to be hopefully developed here in the next couple of years, so it's forcing us to look at what alternate locations we have. I guess a quick comment, it's kind of unfortunate that there isn't regulations, I guess. They're a little more stringent because our initial thoughts on the whole project were let's be as environmentally responsible as we can be. And the parcel of land that we had chosen meets the majority of these criteria here, but one of the things that we were looking or had a strong interest in doing was developing a berm system, an actual wetland treatment system. But when you look at the cost of doing that, it's high. And I mean, the site was favorable, meeting all these criteria, but just the footprint alone, the stripping, recreational wetlands, we were looking at $1.5 million. We took that to council, and I mean, they looked like, I mean, like I had rocks in my head because $1.5 million on a snow dump site. Are you kidding me? When we've got all these other infrastructure problems, you want to spend that much money on a snow dump. And I mean, that's why I say it's unfortunate that there isn't more, environmental protection guidelines in place right now, because I think it's going to fall on deaf ears until those type of regulations are in place and enforced. I mean, we're going to try to do it now. We're going to be basically, with the help of AE, something to that degree, but just not to the degree that we were hoping.
The biggest problem we're facing is, actually I was surprised when we got into this. I can't believe there's no, am I correct, it's kind of a use your best judgment and we'll see if you're fine. Because the government, there's no real anything, it's just kind of use your best judgment, your best practice.
It's not even use your best judgment. It's just do whatever you need to do kind of thing.
Yeah. So it's kind of so I found that very interesting.
But it is impacted by all the other levels of environmental regulation.
Definitely, right. It definitely can.
And it drives me up the wall that if I leave our snow out on the road, full of crap, let it drip right into the catch basin, I'm golden. And if I put it in the heat and it just pisses into the river directly, no problemo. And if I build the heat, then all of a sudden I'm with the microscope. So it's a real tough, honestly, I thought, why can't I just put a catch basin at the end of it and send it into the river the same way I send every other piece of snow that melts in top. And I guess I don't even know where we are in the world with stormwater regs. There's these regs, but I've never been, unless we dump oil into the catch basin, I've never been called on anything.
Yeah, the regulations in Alberta are a little bit stronger, a little bit more progressive.
Yes, goal is a lot different.
Right.
River,
and so, proactive communities like York and, with the population expansion and the development that's occurring in Saskatchewan, it's going to end up there anyways. Right. Maybe not immediately, and I hesitate to put a timeline on there, but
so it was helping. Like I say, I agree with York. I almost wish I had some kind of rules to play by, because then I know I can get it done, meet a certain goal, whatever. Yeah. So basically, from us looking at the Edmonton thing, I just wanted to reassure or get some reassurance. Kind of the general place we're headed is have a place, don't make a mess, have some way of dropping your suspended solids out, and then you're never going to get rid of salt, so have a way of diluting.
Yeah, and if you are discharging into a water body, there is an initial dilution zone that is allowed, right? Okay. And not for all contaminants, but for most of them. But anything in a snow dump, it's not gonna be anything too crazy. As people have mentioned, some don't even use salt, so that won't even be a problem. Right. And concentration, especially in some of these smaller communities of accumulated organics, so your petroleum hydrocarbons are typically going to be low. For a facility like the one in Edmonton, where you are stockpiling mounds and mounds of snow, when it melts, it does concentrate. And so that's where that concern for that one. But for a small pile like the one showed on that picture, I mean, the only thing I can think of is if you are using the same site over like 5, 10, 15 years, you might start to see some increase in levels. But there are options, or some strategies are actually just use the site for 1 year, and then you use a different one, and then rotate so that you're arresting them. And then you're not exceeding any guidelines, and you don't really need too much management.
So I think it's nice for everybody. We're only having a problem because we're growing again. When we're growing, we had this quarter and this quarter and this quarter. Now, the first thing that disappears is you getting to use it as a snow dump once things start growing. Right. And so really what forced my hand, if we were back in the mid-90s in the recession, everything would be fine. Just keep dumping in the same place because nobody's building a house or nothing. Now, I'm the last guy to care about. We're stuck all over the place. And so that's the biggest thing I'd say to each
damn good times.
It's fine.
Good times.
No, but it's whenever, I'm going to try and get it in our community plan or whatever it is. Just like you dedicate land for roadways and everything else,
Right.
you need to pound on everybody, say, no, you've got to give me a chunk of 40 acres per 70,000 people for snow. And nobody believes you. And the only way it's hitting us now is actually the biggest now will be the council, because once you get big enough, all the condos and everybody, 70% of the snow we handle is private snow. And that's what's actually going to help us get our problem solved. Is that these people are starting to pay haul costs, and they're mad.
Well, we ran into that exact same situation. We had a parcel of land outside the town next to a man-made drainage channel that eventually goes past our treatment plant. That, it gives it time to clarify through natural processes. It's just good topography, everything. Talk to planning and engineering for 2 years in advance. We're designated this as snow now. Yep. And then, like you said, the booms, hits, and they're looking for commercial development land, this land, that land. Well, are you sure you need that much of a footprint? And it got shifted over from the ideal location where we have it. But it's still a good location, but you're exactly right.
Well, I think you had a point over
Yeah,
sorry, Harlan.
Similar along the same lines, I was just, like, one of the big barriers to constructing the engineered snow outside is cost. And I was wondering if you, in your research of some of the other places that have actually built them, whether you actually went into financing or how they do it as far as, potentially user pay, because like a lot of people say, most of the snow that comes into the snow outside is private, not on the streets. And whether you look at user pay as sort of funding when you fund the construction and operation.
Yeah, no, we didn't get into that level of detail on how communities fund their students, but that would be perhaps an interesting exploration. Some of the students, like I know for the city of Edmonton, we're talking around the $30 million range. So and that's one of numerous students that they have. So they've obviously taken it to a fairly high level.
Well, I'll just comment on that cost issue, and I don't know what's happening out there today. Again, experience. And there was a time certain jurisdictions out there, because of that issue of the private using the snow dump site, 50% plus coming in there, there were jurisdictions out there that in fact did charge to dump snow in a snow dump site. One would have to do a little research out there to do it. And part of that is going on because of the engineers. There is significant cost. So there are places out there. And however, it does get difficult to potentially implement. I know the one jurisdiction at that time was looking into it. They would just get the chalking outfit, and there would be a lump sum fee for the winter. And then if they have people manning the snow dump site, they would watch to see if the truck come in there and whether it had a sticker on it or not. And if it didn't, well, okay, you're gone, you don't come back and dump until you're got a sticker and there's some policing that way.
What is actually negative environmental effect? Like we're talking about spending a lot of money, but as far as I know, it affects the fish. If plant is fairly valuable, would that solve the penetrate? How far it will penetrate? And if it's not, then we just create salt mines for the future generations.
There's a lot of aspects that you have to consider to answer the question. You are correct. Your site location is going to depend on the geology and the hydrogeology, where the groundwater is and all that stuff. And like I mentioned, you have to consider if you're setting it here, is that like in the city of Yorkton, I think they use a lot of their aquifers for drinking water. So is that an aquifer that's tied to that? Typically, and again, it depends on the concentration of the contaminants in the snow. Typically, what will happen is when that snow melts, your mobile contaminants like salt and stuff, that might run off with the runoff. Some of your hydrophobic stuff in your settings will get left behind, and that will accumulate on a layer of crust. So even that, as a management strategy, what you can even do is to minimize your risk of nutrient contamination. You can every year just scrape off the first 10 centimeters, dispose it, replace it. And that way you're pretty sure that you're not going to contaminate the environment. But for salt effects on the environment, on volumes that Edmonton is dealing with, you can see some potential problems with that. But with the communities, there is some assimilation capacity in soils and wetlands that can handle that kind of salt. Organics will naturally degrade. So your biggest concern is salts and suspended solids. Toxic effects to fish, concentrations of salt have to get pretty high. To plants, a lot of plants, there are something called salt tolerance plant species, so we do design a wetland to make sure you pick those plant species that can tolerate the salt content. But high salt loads can degrade the quality of your soil as well. The soils in northern Saskatchewan gets into soil, decreasing soil fertility and your soil structure is negatively impacted as well. So again, you have to consider if there's, is it on agricultural land, and in the future, is that land use of snow not going to change, like you mentioned, and when that city grows around it, then what? But if you use your best management practices, you can limit your liability, and then when you do that initial site assessment, it'll be like, well, these guys, part of your site assessment will be they use best management practices, and historically it hasn't been used, so chances of contamination are low, so you can sell it or rezone it pretty simply, especially if you have a monitoring record of what the concentration in the soils were.
I was just curious if you guys had any insight on what drove this in Alberta, because I certainly understand what everybody's saying here. You go to your council and say we should do this, it would be the right thing to do, and you think, oh, that's going to cost a lot of money, we don't have to, so we'll put that aside for later. So is there something that drove it in Alberta? Because it really seems odd to me that they would have gotten into this in such a big way that meanwhile Manitoba and Saskatchewan haven't even looked at this yet, really.
Nothing that I'm aware of, but I know Alberta just in general is a bit more advanced in a lot of their environmental policies. Just kind of like the United States are more advanced in their water quality objectives for drinking water, and Canada kind of lags a bit, and Saskatchewan even lags a bit behind that. I'm not exactly sure behind like the politics of that. It may have something to do with population-based demand. I'm not quite sure.
So it's greater urbanization.
Yeah, I think it probably stemmed from just from those mountains. It probably just developed from the sheer volume of snow that they were dealing with. And then, you take a holistic approach to solving your problem. You're not just designed for volume, you can design for contamination and stuff like that. But
I was just thinking that if there was something that happened in Alberta, that maybe we could look at that and say, well, geez, because of the urbanization that's happened and now that's going on in Saskatchewan, that there's maybe a tool for selling your councils on these things to say, look what happened here, and we're starting to see a boom here, so maybe this thing is just around.
Right, and I think decisions like this are largely based on regulations. If there's no regulation, unlikely that your council is going to approve any budgets to do it. If you don't have to do it, chances are you're not going to do it. But on the other side of the coin is, if you do practice best management practice, so if there is a change and you have a snow dump site and you had, followed some of these recommendations, well, then you can get rid of it pretty easily and change it without too much trouble. So it's just more of a long-term vision right now, unless there is, of course, like Garret mentioned, a change in regulations.
I know Regina has a brand new subdivision where the snow dump used to be.
Right.
You went from Regina. Know the story behind that? Did the developer remediate that site?
Yes, they did.
Stantec did the plan for that. In fact, it was totally graded the other way, wasn't it? Yeah. It was sloping, that parcel of land used to slope towards the south, and they tilted it the other way.
I think what happened was part of their Stantec or Dundee developments design and going a little bit because of both sides of the fence. On that one, working for the city of Regina was responsible for road maintenance at the time. Stantec, I see some of the things from the other perspective now. It was there, it was monitored, and yes, it went down. Could have likely developed industrial commercial on the site. The contaminants weren't that great that it was going to harm anything that way. I fought because, as responsible for the budget, I didn't want to do anything at that point in time. However, from the developer's point of view, and this is something that I can share with you, so it might be experience or something that you may want to use in the future. Having worked at Stantec and listening to some of the things and comments of people, even home people come in and say, well, gee whiz, there was this issue over in Harbor Landing because of the snow dump site. Boy, the basement, the salt's attacking the concrete and all these other great things. At that point in time, there had not been a house built on the site where the snow dump was. And not likely will be. I believe that's a commercial, designated for commercial area, and it was done, I think, with the snow dump site being kept in mind. So there are issues like that out there. And when I say it's off from both sides, well, I can see why Dundee was fighting to have that site cleaned up for themselves. It was, they owned the land, and the site was out there for quite a number of years. I'm not sure how long. But I know it was being used when I started in the city of Regina 15 years later. It was, well, not quite that long, I guess it was after that, but certainly 13 years plus. That was being used. But one thing about it, when people come in and buying homes, Dundee was very much able to say the site had been remediated.
But you raised it, Carl, there was a significant intangible in this town. There was a really ugly rumor that went around when that subdivision was being built that, you know, like you said, foundations are collapsing, there's acid in the soil, blah, blah, blah. It was all bullshit, quite honestly.
Yes.
But it was everywhere.
Yeah.
And the developer had to make a public statement to the contrary. It was so bad. So just for your councils and whoever, when you think about future development, some of these intangibles will come into play. I drove by that snow dump for years, and when they said they were going to build houses there, I said, I ain't going to live there, no way. So, you know.
Well, personally, I wouldn't have been scared to myself, but that's just me. And the other thing, and now I believe it touched on it, the soil does rejuvenate itself over time, because again, with the city of Regina in there, when I first started looking, there was a number of different sites. And they use small amounts, and then, as you were saying, development comes along and get pushed out and other places. But some of those sites being retested, monitored, and in the presentation I gave, there was some people that are jurisdictions that monitor the sites. Well, that's part of it. I can see what's happening with it. And over time, some of the sites that the city had used, years later, go back and do some more testing on it. It's okay.
I just wanted to mention and just touch on what Carlisle said there is public perception plays a big role in your environmental decisions. It's not always just about the science. I mean, like you said, if it's perceived that the snow dump was there, I mean, so if you have put up a fence, you have a wetlands, either whether it's doing what it's supposed to or not, at least the public perceives that you were trying to at least mitigate some of those adverse impacts. So.
Has there been any studies done on the, what you call it, the snow equivalent to a given percentage of, say, whatever Sandsville used to what feedlot contribute to the water basin? Like we're Swiffer, we have the Swiffer Creek, which drains to Deaconbaker Lake, so it's a step from there. It would be interesting to know how many tons of pickle snow, so to speak, will equate to what a cow contributes to the water. Because, the cheaper option might be for cities just to start feedlots. Snow there. Do that.
Yeah, I'm sure somebody's done some, but these kind of studies are always, if somebody's done a study, say in a different basin or a watershed, I mean, you can't really extrapolate. You could do a study like that, but I think it's a lot of effort for some data that's really not going to help you in the end. But it would be cool to kind of know, because you got to consider a lot of meteorological data that'll influence that, like dilution and precipitation and all that kind of stuff, and infiltration. So it'd be a pretty good big study, but
yeah. The point is, what is the real impact?
Right. Well, yeah, relative.
Here, relative to.
Right, but again, that also comes down to perception. People aren't, feedlots aren't in the forefront of people's minds right now as harmful. Maybe a snow dump is. Something's triggered that, but
Don't worry, soon we'll have no cattle industry.
Yeah. Feedlot management plan.
Sorry, Glenn?
That raised the question in my mind, in the York situation, what is the
not sure about that answer.
To be honest, I believe that's something that we have to be consulted with. It's probably a good idea, more than that.
We did communicate with the EPO for that area, and they, just like the Regina folk from the Ministry of Environment, they didn't refer to any regulations, and they basically said, yeah, we have nothing.
Well, that goes with the understanding.
Yeah, if you assume watershed stewardship, I think a pretty active group, they've been involved with the city of York with respect to their wetlands development. So it seems to me that their perspective is the kind of public perspective that's been talked about here.
Right, and I think because this is new ground, I think the city of Yorkton has a good position to kind of set a standard and impress some people.